So think about the problems we're trying to solve, right? Like we're talking about trying to create space for frequencies. You can think about that while you're recording as well, right? And maybe solve those problems so that we don't even have to do this.
If you're wondering why you should even know about all of this, that's exactly why. This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benediktine, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, man. I am sleepy, exhausted, but having fun in the middle of making an album right now with a band, and just in the thick of it right now. It's great. How are you, buddy?
I'm great as well, but funny enough, I'm sleepy as well for completely different reasons, but it's going to be a fun episode if we're both sleepy. But I'm fine, and I slept well, and all is good, like no stress or anything, but I switched up my diet quite a bit, and I consumed way less carbs at the moment than I used to, and I haven't consumed like refined sugar in 8 weeks or so, except for like two exceptions where the craving just got too much. But like other than that, I was consistent, and for a week now, I'm eating a lot more fat and a lot less carbs, not only sugar, but carbs in general, pasta and bread and everything. And I'm feeling well, and my energy levels are more consistent already, but it's overall, I'm a little sleepier than usual. Like I just need to get used to it, I think. Like I'm constantly like hungry. I eat a ton, but I'm constantly a little hungry. I'm constantly a little tired, and I just need to get used to it. But I'm feeling pretty good, actually, despite that. So let's see how that goes.
Cool. My diet is similar to yours, usually. Not when I'm living with this band. I tell you, we drink a lot of beer here.
Yeah.
Do you do the bulletproof coffees? You ever done those?
Not really, because like I'm on a vegan diet. So
okay. Yeah.
For 10 years or so already. So I don't eat butter or anything. But the only, like, I can't call myself vegan because the only non-vegan stuff I eat is the eggs from our ducks, from our runner ducks that I was talking about on the podcast. And like, I don't want to waste those. They taste just like chicken eggs and they are wonderful. So I eat those. But with the exception of those duck eggs, our own duck eggs, I don't eat any animal products.
Right.
But I do something similar. I put like coconut oil or coconut fat in the coffee or tea.
Yeah.
And that works. So it's not really bulletproof, and it's not as much because then it tastes gross, but a little bit I add to beverages just to get enough like calories and fat during the day.
Totally.
So how I didn't know that you were doing that as well. So
I mean,
it's like a low carb diet then, or
low. Like I definitely, it's just by being in a relationship with my fiance that's my diet kind of thing.
Okay, cool.
So like generally we eat really well, but left to my own devices, not the same at all.
Okay.
So
I'm just always experimenting. I'm not sure if I'm gonna stick with it. I just wanted to try it. I heard so many people talk about it, obviously, and like I want to try fasting. I want to try I'm not gonna be on a whole like keto diet, I think, but I want to try it out and see what it does. And
it's good to experiment and see what works for sure.
Some things just don't work for certain people, but others do, and I just like to experiment. So I'm doing that a lot, and also I added like cold showers and ice baths and stuff like that, and like all sorts of things. And I think my body's just confused about what's happening right now.
It's under attack. My latest success has been giant fruit smoothie, or not fruit smoothies, vegetable smoothies with some fruit, I guess, in the morning. That's like my breakfast a lot of the days these days. And that gets me through pretty far. Like I can make it through a late lunch just off that smoothie and some coffee with some like MCT oil and stuff like that to get some fat in me.
Yep, love it. I've been doing that for years, actually. Like the smoothie breakfast is something I've done always with more vegetables than like not as much fruit, more veggies and fat and nuts and all that. But totally.
Yeah, that's an amazing, I don't know how that got under my radar. You can just have like all the healthy stuff at once and it tastes good.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing.
Yep. Anyway, don't want to bore our listeners with like nutrition stories. Too late. Yeah, exactly. But I just thought it's funny because we're both like a little tired, but we'll see how it goes. So, on today's topic, like we have been talking about gates and compression in the last two episodes, which are sort of basic.
I have to interrupt you.
Sorry?
I have to
Oh,
have
okay,
one more
okay.
story, because last week I talked about how excited I was to record a drum kit, sound cymbals, and just overdub cymbals and do shells and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
And I described this whole plan using electric cymbal pads to do so. That totally didn't work.
Oh, shit. Okay.
The cymbal pads we had anyways, and I'm wondering if this is where I went wrong. If any of our listeners have done this and it worked for you, I'm really curious. I want to pick your brain. But the cymbal pads we had were way too loud to work.
Okay.
Like the noises coming off them totally wasn't going to fly. So we ended up just doing it normal. Turned out awesome. That's fine. You got to adapt. But I wanted to mention it because I talked about how we were doing this thing.
Okay. And like you couldn't even like dampen them or put foam on them or whatever to not make like.
We could have, but it was like this combination of like, is it worth disrupting his performance with like this thing that doesn't bounce like it should? Yeah, you know, we could have done the air drumming thing, but that really affects the groove, I think. Yeah. So we just decided like, let's revert. Like, we didn't want to just be attached to it because that was our plan. Like, it was like, okay, like if we need to pivot, let's pivot. Yeah. And then the other thing is that when we like did our tests, it was like, it sounds good with the cymbals on. It's like, it's still a rock and roll drum sound. It's going to be fine. Let's do it.
Okay. Yeah. That's, yeah. I mean, it's even better in a way if it works. So yeah, I totally forgot to ask about that. But like, there was one other thing actually I wanted to ask you about the session, because you were telling me before we started recording today that you built a cloud, and I'm seeing behind you all the acoustic material lying around. So did you build the room just for that session, or did they build it anyways for them? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's in their jam space, but this band's just awesome in that I like was like, just invest in treating it. It's going to, and your jam space is going to be better after. They listened to our episode with Yesko and all that, and yeah, they built a crap load of panels. We got insulation above the drummer. We got a hole in the wall for running a snake. You know, they just like were like, well, this will be useful for us in the future. No problem. Let's do it. And that was essential for sure. It was great being able to like record some drums and be like, we need to do more, and go in there and just get more.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And then same, you can't see it, Benny, but I've got like a horseshoe around me of big panels. It's great.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds awesome. I was about to say, like, if Malcolm sounds different today, it's because he's in a different room. But I don't know if people would have noticed, because it sounds good. So
yeah, I'm going to be curious to hear if you can tell the difference. It's definitely not as dead as my room, but it's surprisingly dead in here.
How does the room sound though for drums then? Like, do you have any usable room sound or?
Yes, I was able to get my hands on a really cool R84. Do you know those AEA ribbon mics?
Yep.
The big pill ones. Yeah. They sound awesome pretty well anytime. And they're so dark that, again, not having the cymbals on, it was like, this is still going to work. I threw it behind a couch. So it's even darker. It's pretty darn cool, man. The room, we only treated half of the room, like the drum side of the room. And so we got this really cool, like mid-rangey attack kind of bloom on the snare and shit. Yeah, I'm really stoked on it. Great drum tech come in, Jacob. Love you, buddy. And yeah, it definitely worked. I'm stoked. It'll be fun to mix.
Awesome. Super cool. Now, it's like 7 o'clock in the morning for you right now, right? Or 8 almost.
7:45 now, yeah.
So is the band even up yet? Like,
oh, hell no.
When are you going to start like the session today?
I mean, I get out like between now and like, normally I'm in the studio by 8 these days when I'm up here, because we've been staying up so late. And then I'll start editing or whatever. And then pretty much when they show up, they show up.
Okay.
Between 9 and 10, somebody appears usually.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just wondering, because like, if you're running late and you're recording this episode so early, like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, most people listening to this has probably picked up that I'm a morning person by now. And it's hilarious with this band. We were up to like 2:30 the other night. I was like, what is happening to me?
Yep. Yeah. Do you still, like, that's the last question, then we get into the episode, I promise. Do you still wake up the same time though, even if you go to bed very late? Because I find that this happens to me more and more. Like, sometimes if I stay up really late for some reason, I still get up at like 5:30 or 6,
right?
Without a clock, just like without the alarm clock, just because my body's used to it.
I do wake up, but in this case, when we're staying up that late, I make myself go back to sleep.
Yeah, of course. That's easy. That always works. But okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I just tend to get like alert at the same time every day.
Yeah, it's trained into us by now.
Yeah, cool.
After a year of doing this podcast.
Cool. So, now on to today's episode. What we're going to talk about is kind of an extension on what we were talking about like the last two episodes. We talked about compression and gates, like basic concepts episodes. And there's one thing we briefly discussed and mentioned like in these episodes, and that thing is called sidechaining, or using the sidechain input or the sidechain in general of devices like compressors or gates. And we wanted to do an episode on just that. And don't worry if you've never heard about sidechaining or like what that is. That's not something you need to do during recording necessarily or like at all. It's more of a mixing thing. But we thought it might be interesting to just to give you the complete picture of like compression and gates and what you can do with them, and also to just get a better understanding of like some advanced mixing techniques that are out there, what we do to your tracks, and what you can also experiment with yourself when you're mixing yourself or doing rough mixes or whatever. It's just a very cool concept that, you can do a lot with it. You can fix a lot of problems with it. You can use it creatively. And it's sometimes the solution to things that you just can't fix otherwise. So we thought it's a great thing to know about and a fun thing to talk about. So we're going to do that today. Sidechaining is the topic. And before we start explaining what it is, why you need it, and how to do it, I want to remind you once again that you can or should absolutely join our Facebook community. It's the selfrecordingband.com/community, or just search for the Self-Recording Band on Facebook. And we always have like podcast discussion threads in there. You can like ask questions about this. If this is too advanced for where you're at right now, or if you want to know more about it, just post in the community. We're trying to help. Other people will definitely chime in and help. And it's in general like a cool place to hang out and get your questions answered, meet peers. Just go to the selfrecordingband.com/community, and we're excited to see you in there.
Absolutely.
So sidechaining. How do we start this to make this
it's tricky.
To make this as easy as possible? Because it's an advanced thing, but it's once you get it, it's actually not as complicated.
Right. Yeah. Again, I do think it's good that we're talking about it because people probably see like the option in some plugins or whatever in their DAW. And it does get talked a lot about, especially in like the EDM pop production world. Sidechain runs rampant, and actually it's part of recording in that case. It's part of making the sounds. So if you're in that realm, you're curious or you already know what we're talking about. But in the rock realms that Benny and I live in, it also exists in the mixing realm. But essentially how I think of it is let's look at our gate, or we can use a previous example. So if you haven't listened to the compression or gating episode, the last two episodes we've done, I think they're entirely required before starting this one. I would totally do them in that order. But if we think about the gate, where we talked about a threshold being reached and then the gate releases. So if you had the snare track going, and here comes my drum samples again, you can set it so the threshold only hears those loud snare spikes, right? And at that point, the gate knows to release and let sound through. But what if you didn't want it to be signaled or like controlled by the snare signal? That's where sidechaining comes in, is that we can actually decide that we want the signal that the threshold of the gate detects to be listening to an entirely different track. So that could be the vocal or a guitar. So you could have it so that like a mic only opens up when a guitarist hits a really loud note. I mean, I've never done something like that. It kind of seems something that you wouldn't do, but you could. Essentially, a sidechain is two signal paths. There's the path that it listens to, and then there's the path that gets affected by the threshold of what is being listened to. Did I explain that? Did that make any sense?
I think it does. I mean, it's always hard to tell because we know about this stuff, so I can follow your explanation, of course. I don't know what it's like for people who've never heard of it, but it totally makes sense. So any processor or plugin that has a sidechain input has like those two paths that Malcolm just described, the signal path and the sidechain. And the sidechain is what the plugin listens and reacts to. So you feed it with with whatever it is that you sent there. So you feed it with the signal through the sidechain. The plugin listens to that and reacts to that, but it applies the processing to the actual signal that's going through the plugin. So if you put a plugin on a track, it's going to affect that track, but it's not going to react to whatever's on that track. It's going to react to something else that you sent to the plugin. That's the what, basically, what it does, what it is. And now, I think you've already touched on it. Like, there's multiple reasons why you would want to do that. The first is to do like corrective stuff, to address problems. So you could do that to control problematic frequencies. You could do that to make a compressor pump or to avoid unwanted pumping. And that we're going to get into how you actually do this. You can use it to duck a signal. So whenever, what Malcolm just described, whenever a signal hits the plugin through the sidechain, it's going to duck down the signal that's on the actual track. So it makes space for that. You can do that. You can you can correct all sorts of things. You can de-ess a signal. You can do all sorts of things. And when it comes to correction, but you can also use it creatively. You can use the pumping creatively. That's what EDM producers do all the time. When you have a bass note and it pumps with the kick, that's exactly what happens. Like, you send the kick drum to the sidechain, the compressor reacts to it and lowers the volume on the bass every time the kick drum hits. So that makes the bass pump. That's a common example. So you can do creative things, or you can correct things, or you can use it as a utility tool. Like, we've been talking about it in the MIDI episode and also in the gating episode a bit, where you could send key spikes, little impulses, to the sidechain of a gate, and the gate will listen to that, react to it, and open every time this little impulse happens. And every time that it opens, it will let the actual signal through. So you can use those key spikes to get a perfect timing on a noise gate to make it open just perfectly, and which will work way better than just having it react to the actual drum track, for example. So it's just a nice workflow and utility tool in a way also. So there's different applications of it. But the basic idea is, as we said, just you have one signal path and you have the sidechain, which is what the plugin or the hardware device listens to. Now, you need to know, when you don't use the sidechain, a compressor, for example, listens to what's on the track that the compressor is processing, and it applies it to that same track. Like, the sidechain and the signal path are the same. So there's always like the signal that the plugin listens, quote unquote, listens to. But when you use the sidechain input, it's separate. That's the difference. And also hardware does that as well. So it's not only plugins, there are hardware devices with a sidechain input. So if you plug something in there and send a signal there, the compressor stops listening to the actual signal and starts listening to whatever's in the sidechain input, but applies the processing still to the actual signal.
Yes. Yeah. I think we should keep giving examples of doing this, because I think it'll help listeners visualize and understand what we're talking about better, and why as well, right? My most common is probably ducking the low end of a bass guitar when the kick hits. So let's consider that. I throw on a multiband compressor on a bass track, and a multiband compressor, which we haven't really talked about in depth, but just lets you compress different frequency ranges independently, kind of thing. So you don't have to compress the whole bass track. You can just compress the subs if you wanted. And in that case, that's what I'm doing. I set it so that it'll just duck the subs on that bass guitar. And then instead of making it listen to the bass guitar, though, I sidechain in the kick track, for example. And now when a kick hits, it hits the threshold of this multiband compressor. And on those instances of the kick being hit, it ducks the low end of that bass guitar. And for me, it's because I want the low end of the kick to take priority in a situation like that, right? And all of these examples are not every single time things we always do, by the way. These are specifically done because of what we're hearing. So don't just start doing all this. But that's a really easy and practical thing to think about. It's like, okay, the speakers are going to want to reproduce one thing, So let's choose if we want the kick or the bass. And it's pulling the bass guitar out of the way and letting that kick through, essentially. So it hears a kick, it knows to duck the low end on the bass, and voila, it's done that kind of thing.
Yeah. You also, if you do it like in a subtle way so that it doesn't pump audibly, you get a more consistent low end with that. So it sounds like it would move more, but it actually doesn't, because like if you think about it, you have a bass guitar that has some, I don't know, let's say the kick has the fundamental at 60 hertz, for example. And you have a bass guitar there that's always going to have, or most of the time, is going to have something happening at 60 hertz. Now, every time the kick comes in, it adds to that already existing low end. So you get an additional boost at 60 every time the kick comes in. Now, if you duck the bass in that specific frequency area, then the overall level of 60 hertz is more consistent because the kick comes in, but the bass goes away at the same time and then comes back in. So you get an overall more consistent low end.
Exactly.
And that's oftentimes pleasing, and you get a really solid foundation that way. And so that's a really cool trick that a lot of people use. I like to do that as well. It's a little different to what the EDM thing that we just described earlier, because what you usually do there is you duck the whole bass and not just like the low end.
Yeah, that's like the wah, wah, wah kind of thing.
Here we go with another sample.
Yeah, but like that's interesting because it's important to realize that the sidechain doesn't have to be audible, right? So you can mute the kick that controlling that, swelling bass thing, and we are left with this bass pad that just swells whenever a kick would have hit, right? The sidechain doesn't have to be in the mix. It could just be there to control.
Totally. Yes, another common example would be, or I don't know if it's common, like something I like to do is, for example, if I have a ton of hi-hats in overhead tracks that people send me, and I want to get a better balance between the hi-hats and the crashes, for example, which is a common problem. We've talked about like the whole balance within the kit a lot of times, and it's just so important to get that right. But it still happens that people play the hi-hat really loud and the crash is not loud enough or anything like that. And if that happens and I have a dedicated hi-hat mic, for example, also, I'll oftentimes mute the hi-hat mic. I pull the fader down all the way so that the actual hi-hat mic is not audible because I got plenty of it in the overheads. But I'll send the hi-hat to the sidechain of a multiband compressor on the overheads, which will duck the very high frequencies where the hi-hat, or the frequency range where the hi-hat is dominant. So every time the hi-hat is playing, it gets rid of some of the top end of the actual overhead signal, which reduces the perceived level of the hi-hats in the overhead mics. Sometimes it doesn't work and it just distorts the high end, but sometimes it works. And it's just a little trick to get less sibilance and a better balance in the overhead tracks. I do that oftentimes. So
yeah, that's a nice corrective way to go.
Yeah.
Something I've had a little bit of luck with. There's like whole plugins coming out based on sidechaining because it's become pretty popular in mixing over the last couple of years. There's one called Track Spacer.
Oh yeah.
And it listens to a sidechain, and then it pretty much analyzes the EQ of the signal coming in and applies the opposite to whatever you throw it on. So again, using the bass and kick drum, it hears a kick drum and takes those same frequencies out of the bass guitar. So it's kind of like automatic mixing in a way. Really easy to overdo, but like something I've been doing with that on like a really vocal focused part of a song is sidechaining the vocal in onto my guitars, and it just like carves out a little bit of the mid range I want the vocals to occupy in real time, and it's like it's kind of like just creating a little space, really subtle, but it's instead of boosting the vocals louder, they just get to stay where they are and they create space themselves, kind of thing. So you can have like little auto mixing starting points with this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's this whole category of plugins using this technique totally. And there's also a thing that I totally forgot about, but it's like something you've all heard or hear on a daily basis, basically, which is ducking that's used in like broadcast, for example, or like with voiceover stuff. Or if you have, for example, music playing on the radio and then a voiceover comes in like some I don't know what the English term for that is, like the people talking on the radio. I don't know.
Voiceovers.
But yeah. So you could do it manually, of course. You could just turn the music down and turn the voice up, but you could also have a compressor on the music, and whenever someone starts talking, it will duck down the music and the voice will become audible, and when you stop talking, the music will come back up. So that's a very common thing, not only on the radio. It's like I don't know. You could do that if you're if you're a DJ and you use a microphone and want to say something, you can have that like auto ducking function, which is sidechain compression. So just same principle applies. You have one signal. When it comes in, the other signal will go away, and when the signal stops, the other signal will come back up. So voice over ducking is pretty common, and a lot of you will have already heard that probably.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great example. So let's see. We've talked about what it is. We've talked about why we use it, and kind of by talking about how we use it, we kind of describe the technical side of it too. But I guess we should just give you a little bit of a visualization of what that looks like. If you pull up a compressor, you're probably going to see a button that says sidechain, or in Pro Tools, there's like a little key icon sometimes. And pretty much somewhere there's going to be a place where you can select what the input of the sidechain is. So you just got to find that. Not all plugins have it. That's worth noting. Not all compressors are capable of it, or just plugins in general. So be aware of that. And then, so you just choose what you want the input to be, and then you might have to go still and find another button to tell it to listen to it. Just setting it, like I'm thinking with like the FabFilter stuff, you can set the sidechain in, but it doesn't start listening to it until you actually go and tell it to listen to it on like the band or whatever inside of the plugin. So that's where user manuals come in.
Exactly.
Read the user manual.
Totally. So you start by inserting the plugin on the signal that you want to process. Then, as Malcolm described, turn on the sidechain or activate the sidechain on the plugin. Then see if you need to turn on anything else in the plugin itself. And then send a signal to that sidechain via your usual like sends in the DAW, usually, like the same way you would send a signal to a reverb, for example. Just select the sidechain input, send the signal there, and then you dial in the plugin. And you need to know that from that point on, the plugin listens to the sidechain and not the processed signal, as we said. Now, everything that we've been mentioning right now was about like sidechain inputs and sending signals there. There's actually another way to use or manipulate the sidechain, which we haven't talked about, but just very common, and that is some plugins, especially compressors, have sidechain EQ or filters. What that is like without having, you can manipulate the sidechain without having to send an outside signal to it. So what that does is, if you have a compressor, for example, on a drum, let's take a drum group, the whole drums. You have a compressor on there, and you dial it in the way you think it sounds cool, but then it starts pumping every time the kick comes in. So you want the attack on the snare drum. You love the glue. You love the overall vibe, but it's just pumping a little bit too much when the kick drum comes in. Now, what you can do is, if that compressor has a sidechain filter, you can filter out the low end from the sidechain so that the compressor doesn't react to the kick drum as much. It will still apply the processing to the whole signal, and the low end will still come through. So you're not filtering the actual low end on the track. You're filtering the low end in the sidechain, in the second path. So the compressor is listening to a signal that has less kick drum and will kind of ignore the kick drum in a way, and then apply a more consistent and less pumping sound and compression to the drums. Another application of this is what a distressor has, for example, built in, and a couple of other compressors as well. You could also boost a certain frequency range to have the compressor react more to it, to focus on it. So, for example, if you boost the upper mid-range or the top end in a compressor sidechain, then the compressor will listen to a signal that has more top end to it and will react to harsh stuff more. That way you can compress and at the same time sort of de-ess a little bit. So when I push that button on the distressor, for example, it's wonderful on vocals almost every time, because every time a harsh sibilant sound happens, or if the person like sings really loud and like high note that gets a little too much, the distressor will react to that more and control it a little bit more, and you don't have to de-ess as much. It's just more controlled. So you can either make the compressor ignore a certain frequency or focus on it, depending on how you manipulate the sidechain. And some compressors have just these basic functions. Others have like whole EQ sections where you can really dial in and make the compressor focus on a very small frequency range, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, that can be totally handy, especially with like gating and stuff like
Oh
that.
yeah, gating
Like,
as well. Like what's
yeah.
what's an application where you would use the sidechain filters on a gate? How would you do that?
Okay, so say here's a situation I've done it on. You have a kick drum that doesn't have a hole in it, and for whatever reason you can't put one in it, so you have to mic it just from the outside, and you end up with more bleed in your kick signal that way. And maybe the snare or a cymbal is pretty loud in it, so you throw a gate on there, and you are having the gate open when a loud cymbal is hit. Let's say. Now you can go in and EQ the sidechain filter to only listen to the low frequencies. So thinking of, again, the fab filter stuff, there's like just a low or high frequency cutoff. And you can just roll off all the top end. And you can actually, here's a button you can click. In some plugins, there's a listen function. So you can click listen and it'll play what the sidechain information is. And so you can monitor what it's hearing, which can be really useful. So in this case, you would click it and then you could just roll off top end until you're only hearing kick drum, essentially, just that boom. And then that's what it's going to listen to, and that's how it will open instead of having all that information. You're just kind of focusing what it listens to.
Cool. Yeah, super neat little trick with the kick out mic. Absolutely. To sort of ignore the bleed and just make the kick, or the gate on the kick listen to the actual kick.
Yeah. One more that I would do, and especially with hardware compressors, is on vocals. I'll often take out low end on what the sidechain is listening to. So it's still listening to the vocal, but it is taking out some sub frequencies. So it doesn't react to a big puh and just like gain reduced like to a crazy degree. You can get a smoother compression out of filtering what it's listening to. So that's a like pretty good practical example. And that's actually practical to you recording, because obviously this is a podcast about recording more so than about mixing. I still think this is useful to know for communication, and also think about the problems we're trying to solve, right? If you have, like we're talking about trying to create space for frequencies, you can think about that while you're recording as well, right? And maybe solve those problems so that we don't even have to do this.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most valuable takeaways you can get from this episode. If you're wondering why you should even know about all of this, that's exactly why, what you just said, Malcolm. Even if you don't ever apply any of this yourself, you just learned a ton of like scenarios again that are potentially problematic that you could solve. So we don't need to use all this trickery.
Yeah. What do you think about bass being played a little behind the kick drum?
Depends.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It depends on the genre, but in general, it can be cool. Sometimes the other way around as well. But like, I mean.
So I've got a theory, which I wouldn't even say a theory. I think it's just fact. But essentially, sidechaining a kick drum and a bass guitar wasn't a thing when, or at least I'm pretty sure nobody was doing that on Bob Marley,
Yeah.
And it felt good when the bass was behind them, right? But I think it was just essentially manual sidechaining, essentially, in that the kick drum gets through and then that bass hits. Like they were pretty much just nailing that effect by playing it that way. In that it was creating space for that low end to behave so well. Nowadays, I think that syncing them sounds better, and using this tool is actually like a better, like more full sound. Again, it's going to depend on the genre, like you said, but that's my theory.
Yeah, in general, I agree. And also, you can be a little late on the bass without it sounding really late, because the kick will take care of the low end, like
it sustains
when it hits, and then it will mask whatever that happens on the bass, like the attack on the bass. So if you're a little late, it won't be audible, but it will create a little more space. So I totally agree that this can work very well. But I also think in the Bob Marley example, it's partly that, but it's partly also just the feel. So I don't know if I would agree with that. It's better to do it with the tools these days. I think there is something. Like, I don't know, there's just something about the way they play and they groove and everything, and I think
it's the
cool.
tastiest stuff.
Yeah. But I agree that this could be part of the reason why they did it, or it just, maybe they didn't even know, but it just felt better, and that's the reason.
Oh yeah, I think it was just like these guys sound good when they play together.
Yeah.
The other thing to consider with that, I mean, this is silly to be talking about, but essentially is that nowadays in rock, especially, our bass guitars have way more attack. So it doesn't sound great when they are, like, it creates a flam kind of thing.
Yeah.
When you can hear the attack of the kick drum and the attack of the bass, obviously out of sync like that. Where those Bob Marley ones are just fat. low end.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. So I think that's plenty for you to think about and process for now. It's a pretty advanced topic, but I hope you got an idea of like how it works and why we wanted to talk about it. What I would love to hear from you is if any of you can come up or have already come up with like creative uses of this, or like things you do actually during the actual production, because we described it as a mixing tool more than anything. But maybe you've come up with ways to do this while you're producing stuff. Maybe you've done something, uncommon, maybe on purpose, maybe through accident. I don't know, but I'd love to hear your experience with sidechaining, if you have any. Like, if that's always interesting to me, and maybe some people are doing this all the time and we just don't even know. So let us know in the Facebook community. It's the selfrecordingband.com/community. And if you have a cool story to share or a cool trick you like to do, whether it's in mixing or producing, just let us know. If you're doing electronic music, I'm sure there are a lot of like more possibilities to use that during production. In that case, let us know as well. We always love to hear about new ideas and new approaches and unique perspectives. And sometimes through not really understanding a concept and just trial and error, sometimes cool things happen. So maybe you didn't know what it actually does, but you've used it and it was kind of cool. So yeah, just let us know.
Absolutely. Yeah, hope you enjoyed that.
Yes, me too. Then, thank you for listening. See you next week then.
Okay, take care.